Okay, we will get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John French. I'm the Director of University of Toronto Entrepreneurship, or UTE. I'm here today with my colleague Chris Kim, who's the Liaison Librarian at the Centre for Research and Innovation Support, or CRIS. Chris will be putting some relevant links in the chat box throughout the session. On behalf of UTE, the IPO, which is the Innovations and Partnerships Office, and the CRIS team, I would like to welcome all of you to our inaugural session of the IP Matters series, which is today focused on health innovation. We'd like to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to participate and perceive all that is presented today. So should you need to turn on live captions, please go to your meeting controls under More Options and turn on or off live captioning. Before we begin, we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And now for some housekeeping. I feel like at this stage, we're all used to many of these housekeeping notes or guidelines. But as a reminder, please mute your audio and turn off your video to ensure a smooth session, and also to accommodate for those who do not have enough bandwidth. This session, I saw a question, I think from Basil, this session is being recorded. However, to encourage candor among the panelists and audience, the audience Q&A portion at the end of the session will not be recorded. A link to the recorded portion will be sent out shortly after the session ends, and we will hear talks from each panelist, then have a moderated discussion, and then that will be followed by the audience Q&A, the Ask Me Anything or AMA portion of today. To ask questions, please type your question directly into the chat box. We will not be using the raise hand feature. And now, before I hand it off to our moderator, and also to explain why I'm the person kicking things off, I'd like to provide a brief overview of U of T's innovation ecosystem and how it fits into today's session. Next slide, please. UTE is the connective tissue or the glue that brings together all of the incredible entrepreneurial programming that happens across our 3 campuses. On this slide, you'll see the various campus accelerators in the faculties, divisions, campus, and on the campuses. We talk about there being no wrong door for any innovator, entrepreneur, inventor, and while there are different stages of focus or technologies connected to these various accelerators, we are all here to support entrepreneurship and startup creation and activity. Next slide, please. UTE also manages 15,000 square feet of co-working and event space, which is called the On-Ramp, in the Banting building on the St. George campus across from Mars. We're always accepting new members, so for anybody looking to be part of a vibrant community of innovators, please consider joining the On-Ramp. We'd love to see you. Next slide, please. I won't go into any great detail, but on this slide are a smattering of the initiatives and activities that UTE delivers on behalf of our community. I'd draw a quick attention to Entrepreneurship Week, which happens every year in March with over 15 events delivered across the community. We have a startup job board, which is the largest in North America for university startup ecosystems, with over 2,500 jobs and 300 companies. A number of initiatives to support equity, diversity, and inclusion, including our recently launched Black Founders Network. And at the bottom, the IP education program, which brings us all together today. So next slide, please. For those of you not familiar with the IP education program, the University of Toronto has developed 2 levels. Level 1 is IP Foundation, so basic literacy, and everybody across U of T, students, staff, faculty, encourage you to take this. And then level 2, which is IP Strategy and Application, a deeper dive into the U of T Startup Guide, the U of T Inventors Guide, and then patent strategies as well. The province of Ontario has recognized our IP education program as a milestone within their IP action plan. For students, if you complete these free online self-directed, self-paced modules, you'll receive recognition on your co-curricular record. And for those outside of the university ecosystem, they are also available through OpenU Toronto as well as eCampus Ontario. And a great foundation from which to jump off into the topics and the themes that we're going to cover during today's session. Next slide, please. UTE is part of the Office of the Vice President, Research and Innovation, which includes our Innovations and Partnerships Office, or IPO. The IPO is the office that supports U of T researchers and inventors from across the Tri-Campus and helps them turn their ideas, their inventions into products and services. That we also have a partnerships and business development team that helps identify opportunities to advance financial support of U of T R&D through research, grants, etc. And the IPO also manages U of T's IP portfolio, and we're critical in developing the IP education modules. Next slide. Which brings us to the focus on health. U of T is part of this powerful partnership where we are affiliated or tied into 9 fully affiliated teaching and research partner hospitals in Toronto. The University of Toronto tracks nearly $1.5 billion in research dollars annually, and that makes this the largest research center in Canada and the 3rd largest in North America. And one of the reasons that we're talking about the need to protect and commercialize IP that comes out of this ecosystem, especially with our health sciences and life sciences companies. And now, hopefully, having set the stage, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, Tamara O'Connell. Tamara is an IP lawyer and patent agent. As a patent portfolio manager at U of T, she works with university researchers to develop and protect their intellectual property. Tamara also has a background in electrical engineering and works in a variety of technologies ranging from life sciences to information technology. A huge thank you, and over to you, Tamara.
Great, thank you, John, and welcome everyone. So health innovation is a really broad and exciting topic. As you can imagine, it covers a lot of different categories from therapeutics to medical devices, software and AI as well. So a variety of different technologies. And we have an incredible panel with us here today, and they're going to be discussing some of the unique challenges and opportunities that come up, particularly in the context of intellectual property in these health technologies. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our panel. So joining us today is Lawrence McPhee. Lawrence is Director of Intellectual Property at Deep Genomics, a biotechnology company that is focused on the use of AI for developing therapies for genetic diseases. Morgan Berentz is a professor in the Department of Psychology at U of T and Canada Research Chair in Cognitive Neuroscience. Morgan is the CEO and co-founder of HippoCamera. HippoCamera uses a special form of reminiscence to mimic the function of your hippocampus, a part of the brain which plays a key role in memory, to boost recall. Jeff Kang is an IP strategist, lawyer, patent and trademark agent at Norton Rose Fulbright Canada. He helps innovative companies create and execute IP strategies that target defined outcomes such as strategic partnerships, fundraising, and IP defense. And finally, Phil Goldbach is Director of Technology and Venture Development at Toronto Innovation Acceleration Partners, TIAP, which is formerly Mars Innovation. Phil manages intellectual property rights across all technologies within TIAP's portfolio. So we're thrilled to have this panel with us here today. So we're going to just start off with each panelist taking a few minutes to expand on their background and experience in dealing with intellectual property issues in health innovation. Following that, I'll moderate sort of the initial conversation. And then, as noted, sometime after 1, we'll stop recording and at that point switch to the audience Q&A. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Lawrence.
Great. Thanks very much, Tamara, and happy to be here today to speak to all of you about, an exciting topic. Toronto is certainly a great place to be if you're interested in health innovation. A bit about me, I guess I used to work at SickKids a long time ago as an undergrad in genetics. Then went to the UK to do my PhD, came back to U of T for law school. And for the last 15 years, I was a partner at Breskin & Parr, working a lot with U of T, including with Tamara, helping to sort of commercialize and get technology transfer off the ground. Also working with a lot of smaller and medium-sized Canadian companies. But I recently took the jump and moved to Deep Genomics, where I sort of run their patent portfolio and work on all kinds of IP issues for them. So a bit about Deep Genomics. As Tamara said, we started as an AI company. It was Brendan Frey who kind of got things going and is our CEO, and he was a prof at U of T and a computer scientist. But we've sort of made the transition more towards being a biotech company now, with a particular focus on AI, and that kind of gives us our competitive advantage. And that's something that I know a lot of companies are now looking to, who might have some interesting models or some AI technology that they want to apply in a health setting. And that is certainly something that we've kind of gone through already in drug development and sort of have some experience with that. So one interesting thing about, again, trying to do that is you do get exposed to a wide range of issues in intellectual property. So we have some fundamental patents in machine learning and training, but of course we also have IP directed towards therapeutic products themselves. And you do need to adapt and sort of take different approaches to different types of technology. And that is something to kind of recognize. I'll also just point out that you don't necessarily need a patent. And I say that despite being pro-patent, and I think there's lots of opportunities when a patent is exactly the right thing to get. But first and foremost, keep your inventions a secret, and there is trade secret protection. Now, trade secret protection is not particularly powerful, but it does force, the inventors or whoever to sort of look at what technology they might have and crystallize it into a document and mark that as classified or confidential. And that's a key first step, I think, along with getting a business plan and trying to get all these pieces of the puzzle together. So trade secrets are particularly, and that's a term that gets sort of bandied about a lot. And it doesn't just mean keeping things a secret. That's foundational and super important to a trade secret. But it also means, as I said, you want to, crystallize what it is you think is your IP as that secret, and market as confidential. And that's something that you can then, it's almost an asset in and of itself. You can, of course, then file a patent application. A trade secret can become a patent application, but not vice versa, because once things are disclosed out to the public, you've lost that measure of secrecy. So for a lot of early stage startups, I think it's important to first consider almost everything as a secret, as a trade secret, and then sort of at a certain point, pull the trigger, reach out to, innovations of partnership, and perhaps work on that first patent application, which gives you a really important asset that you can then use. And patent applications, they sort of serve three roles. They're a legal document, of course. They're also a technical document full of interesting results and almost a demonstration of what you can do. And they're also a marketing document. But you have control of the pen as you put these things together. So keep that in mind. There's a lot that has to go into a patent application. So take your time, make sure you get those details right. Because it is, in a way, especially early on, almost the public face of a lot of what you might be trying to do. Most patent applications are brutal to read. I apologize on behalf of the profession right away. There's a reason for that, and that's perhaps because of the sort of the multi-headed monster, which it is a marketing, it is a legal, and it is a technical document. But they do need to conform to a certain set format. But yeah, I think that's the key message I want to get across at the start. Toronto is a great place to be in innovation and be innovating in health. There's a lot of opportunities still. It certainly takes a lot of people to get a good company up and going, and a great idea. And so keep that in mind and be sure to reach out when you can. And I know when you have a great idea, we want to share it, but keep it a secret at the start. And that is really, really important. Don't disclose prematurely. That kind of self-inflicted wound where you let something out of the gate before it's probably ready to be let out can be really problematic. And so that's the one big take-home advice is if you have something that you think is important, keep it a secret. And the patent system does, in fact, foundational to the patent system is disclosure. That's why you get a patent. You're going to teach the public how to do something. But the timing is key there. And you certainly can publish and patent, almost concurrently. But it's important to consult with someone who knows how to navigate that system carefully. So I think, Tamara, I'll leave it there and pass it off to, I'm not sure who's next on our roster.
Great. Thanks, Lawrence. Yeah, no, that's really great, valuable advice to kick things off here. We'll pass it over to Morgan now.
Great. Thanks a lot. So I guess I'll just tell you a little bit about my story and what I might be doing here on a panel about IP protection. So I started my faculty position at the University of Toronto in 2009. And before that, my PhD and my postdoc were focused entirely on basic science, so specifically how the brain supports memory. And I did a lot of work with people with memory disorders like Alzheimer's disease, trying to understand at this basic fundamental level how the changes that were happening in their brain affected their memory. And the early focus of my lab was no exception. We spent all of my pre-tenure years pursuing variations of this same theme. How does the brain support memory? But then I got tenure and I kind of had a bit of like the career version of a benign like midlife crisis. At this point in my life, I'd spent nearly 15 years trying to understand, what our brain's hippocampus does. And we made a lot of progress, but I was like, why does this matter? What are we going to actually do with this knowledge? And I'd worked closely with so many wonderful patients who had been so generous with their time, and they'd let themselves be vulnerable as we poked and prodded their cognitive deficits. And we learned so much, but I wanted to have something for them to show for it. And at that point, I thought, what's the point of tenure if not to take risks? And so I decided to do a big pivot for a lot of the resources in my lab. And I managed to convince a brave postdoc, an undergraduate, now turned graduate student, to come along for the ride. And we took a really simple idea, which was, can we take everything that we know about how the hippocampus supports memory and build technology, build a system that mimics that, so it can stand in for individuals who have a damaged hippocampus to support the consolidation and the retrieval of new memories. And that's what we've been working on really since 2015. So at first, our journey started with taking this like totally wacky idea and making it something tractable. And then it was figuring out, how on earth could we build such a system? And then once we had it, we needed to show that it worked. And then at some point along the way, we realized that we had some pretty valuable IP. And if I'm being honest with you, like really absolutely no idea about how to go about protecting it. And most importantly to me, how to get it out into the world so that we could get it into the hands of the people who could stand to benefit from it. So, at the beginning, this process was incredibly daunting. I think I like literally Googled inventions at U of T. And there was a PDF I downloaded, and I just followed the process of disclosing the invention. And then before long, I was, in the warm embrace of a commercialization manager from the U of T's Innovation and Partnerships office, and like I haven't let go of her ever since. And we formed a startup. They set us up with a patent portfolio manager, and I should say, they designed and executed our patent strategy. We filed our initial application in 2018, and I just learned actually this week that we've been granted patent protection in the US, and the process is underway in several other markets with strategic key markets for our product. And now we're starting to think about fundraising and really growing this company into something meaningful, with the power to get our invention out there in a meaningful way. So I'm on this panel, not because I can claim any expertise, I think, beyond my narrow experience here with my company, but I can share with you what it's like to do this when you don't really know what you're doing. And if I can leave you with one piece of advice, it's really to get help. Lawrence intimated this, but patent law and the patent process and this like legalese language that's used in a patent, it's so niche. It's like absolutely, to me, impenetrable, at some level. And I might be good at science and research and coming up with ideas, but there was no way that I could have come up on my own with a viable patent strategy and compose such a document without the help of experts. And what I've seen from my vantage point is that developing a patent strategy is really an art form, and it develops organically based on each particular case. So you need someone with expertise to be able to think outside the box rather than just like following some prescribed checklist. And we have some examples. So our company, we first filed in the UK, not because that was our key target market, but because we knew that the UK decision would give us quick and cheap feedback on our viability, and we didn't have funds at that point to apply to lots of markets. But that particular strategy might not be useful for other companies. And there are also so many tiny mistakes that you can make early on that can like totally blow the whole thing up. And I needed somebody to like put those guardrails on me. And again, Lawrence alluded to this, but especially when it came to not putting our work out there in the public domain. So I had to be repeatedly reminded that if I want IP protection for certain ideas, I could not share those ideas at conferences before that protection was in place. And as a scientist, this was like really, really hard. It went against like fibers of my being because I wanted to share everything with my research community, but you just can't in those early days until those applications were filed. And there was one moment where I like almost blew it all up, and I like reversed in the interview, and it was okay. But you know, I heard my patent portfolio manager like in my ear, you know, the angel or devil or whatever on my shoulder, you know, saying don't button it down. And so, you know, I guess I'll close with this, that as inventors, I think we really lean into independence and we want to do things on our own, but this is one place where I would really encourage others to leave that personality trait to the side. And U of T, you know, this was on the initial deck, like U of T has so many resources, and if they're available to you, I really encourage you to use them. There's so many people that are eager to help, and get this advice early and often. And if you work with an expert, they can help you develop a bespoke plan that works for your particular situation. And if you do this correctly in those early days, your future self is really going to thank you. So thanks a lot. And I look forward to questions, and I'll hand it over to whomever is next.
That's great. Thank you, Morgan. Yeah, it's great to hear about your journey, and I'm excited about digging into it a little bit more. I'm sure some of those aspects will resonate with our audience members, particularly, you know, publishing versus the confidentiality themes that we're talking about. So first off, I'll hand it over now to Jeff, and we'll hear from him.
Thanks, Tamara, and hi, everyone. So I'm Jeff Kang. I'm a lawyer, patent agent, and trademark agent at the law firm Norton Rose Fulbright. So I wear a number of hats there. My job title is IP strategist, which means that I specialize in helping companies create strategies that protect their IP and are useful for commercializing their IP. I am a U of T alumnus. I attended U of T for graduate school and law school. My graduate studies were in biomedical engineering and computer engineering. So, you know, a lot of my law practice these days involves assisting companies in the health innovation space. I guess my version of Morgan's midlife crisis was to leave law and go to a startup in Silicon Valley. We were creating mobile technology. I was responsible for directing IP strategy, creating an IP portfolio, and using IP both to drive partnerships and fundraising. So in my current practice, and I've come back to the law firm, I focus on the same areas. I advise companies on how to obtain and commercialize their IP, but I also represent investors and buyers in evaluating IP and evaluating how companies have performed on IP and whether IP creates risks that jeopardize an investment. And I want to emphasize the word risk here because, you know, most investors don't get excited about a company because of its IP. You know, they get excited about a company because of its vision, of its people, of its technology. But plenty of investors do walk away from an investment opportunity or from a company because, you know, there's risk that they don't like. You know, so based on that, sometimes I get asked the question, or often I get asked the question, how much IP do I need, Jeff? You know, how much IP will my investors expect? And I want to use my time today to hopefully shift your thinking to looking at it from a slightly different perspective, and ask, what should my approach to IP that should be? One, that builds value, and two, is perceived by investors as reducing their risk. So I think there are three main elements that are important to an IP approach. One is you should be strategic. You need a plan. Morgan, mentioned you should have a plan, and you'll thank yourself later. And you need a plan that fits your technology, that fits your business, that fits your way of creating revenue, and is sized for your stage of growth. I've represented companies that have successfully raised millions of dollars, without making a patent filing. But they've established a plan. they have a plan that evidences that they understand the value of proposition, they understand the risks, they understand, what steps that they should take, for example, to convert a trade secret into a patent filing. And that plan acknowledges that, some parts of the plan are expensive. It can be expensive to make a patent filing. But, dear investor, if you give me X dollars of capital, I understand the steps that it takes to obtain that protection. I understand what I need to do in the next 3 months. I understand what I need to do in the next 12 months. So, in the meantime, you ensure that you preserved your options to execute on your plan. You haven't made any untimely disclosures, so that, have a plan. I think the second part is execution. A plan is not worth anything unless you execute. Execution doesn't necessarily mean, making filings, as Lawrence has emphasized, but, if you're going to preserve protection in the form of trade secrets, execution could mean, implementing certain procedures or protocols that preserve secrecy. It could mean, getting some agreements in place that help you preserve secrecy. There's an aspect of execution that is very time sensitive. So I think we'll get into this a little bit more, but my panelists have already mentioned that you got to do things in the right order, in the right time. You got to file a patent protection and then later make your disclosure, at a conference, on your website, through the publication of your thesis. So timing can be important on execution, and you don't want to, lose your rights to get IP because of, you've got the timing or the order of steps wrong. The third part of an IP approach is that it should be holistic, and you need to consider all the different forms of IP that might be useful to you. When we refer to IP, often we're thinking of patents, and certainly patents are important. But we shouldn't overlook the other forms of IP. So I'll just echo, what Lawrence has said about the importance of trade secrets. In health innovation, many technologies now require the use of software code. What are you doing to protect the copyright in your code? What is your approach to open source, the use of open source code in your technology? What are the steps you're doing to protect your branding and trademarks? What's your approach to data? Acknowledging that machine learning is becoming a very important part of health innovation. What feeds into training these models is data, and what is your ownership and rights to use that data, and how does that affect the value of your IP? So having a holistic approach to IP, not being too focused on patents at the expense of forgetting other forms of IP. That's the third part of the approach that I would encourage you to take away from today. And so, at the beginning stages of building a company, having that approach helps you focus on building a really solid foundation. So that foundation is built on having a plan and executing on it, avoiding kind of really foundational issues that you can't solve with any amount of money. So that untimely disclosure, having the wrong agreements in place or not having certain agreements in place, that's really important. And I think I would just end on, and I've talked about risk, but I want to end on a positive note from my part. Not everything has to be perfect. Innovation and ventures are filled with risks, and stakeholders, investors understand risk. The point is to have a strategic approach that helps you manage that risk, helps you identify that risk, and it helps you be sophisticated in your thinking and execution. Sophisticated doesn't necessarily mean expensive, and in fact, having a plan will save you money and will save you headache. So that's it from me, and I'll pass it back to you, Tamara.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I look forward to digging into some of those topics, particularly in terms of crystallizing the plan and just the critical timing of when that plan gets executed. So that's great. And so now I'll turn it over to Phil.
Great, thank you, Tamara, and thanks to U of T for inviting me and for putting on this this event. I think it's very useful, and it's great to think about IP kind of upfront for those trainees in the audience who are really deep with the science or the engineering, but very new to IP, and so I think you've already heard from the other panelists here kind of diverse views. I think there's some great diversity on this panel here of different levels of expertise and insight into IP. And I think just listening to the others right now, I think the take-home message, I will kind of echo it, especially from Morgan, which is think about the stuff early and upfront and get help. You're not going to become a master of IP unless you want to go down that path as a career. It's super specialized, super technical. And use your tech transfer office, which at U of T is the IPO, to really get that help and guidance from that early stage. So I think my role here, I think really is to help kind of bring some color to think about sort of the practical aspects of working with IP within the university and how to collaborate with others and how to bring that IP into a company, when and how, and those types of considerations. So my background, I also, like many of the others here, all of the others, spent some time at U of T, I guess all of us. I did my PhD in the Department of Molecular Genetics. It was very kind of basic science at a sick kids lab, fruit flies and cell division. After that, I did go to law school. I have a law degree. I'm a non-practicing lawyer right now, but I did some training in patent law. Worked with Lawrence for a while, which was a fantastic experience with him and his group of life science patent agents and lawyers. So I really learned kind of how this whole kind of patent world works and how to put together patents, especially in health innovation, as we're speaking about today. After that, I kind of moved more to the IP management side of things. Worked with a few kind of biotech startup companies, and then found my way into Mars Innovation. And as I said in the beginning, that's my organization was Mars Innovation in the Mars Building. We've now changed our name to TIAP, Toronto Innovation Acceleration Partners, but we are the same organization. And so I'll tell you a bit about kind of TIAP and what we do, and I think what will be useful for today is just to give you a little intro to one program that we have focused on drug development and some of the considerations around IP that we had in setting up the program and how to make sure it runs smoothly and how to think about IP for these drug development projects specifically. And I'm looking forward as this goes on to think about these different types of health innovations, because it really is different, your strategy, your considerations for different types of health science innovations. And so very briefly, TIAP works with the academic community. You saw that in the intro, that map of the University of Toronto and the associated teaching hospitals. Those are our members. Those are the groups we work with. We help commercialize technologies coming out of that. We do that by trying to create companies, and we have a few programs. One of the programs we have is Lab 150, which is a drug development program. And we've partnered with a global contract research organization, CRO, called Evotech. They do everything in drug development, sort of medicinal chemistry, pharmacology, all that kind of stuff. And so the way the program works is we identify really strong disease-focused projects coming out of the labs at U of T and the associated hospitals, and identify ones that that we think have very strong validation of a molecular target, in a certain unique approach, unique tools, assays, skills, that it all fits together. And at the end of the day, we see a path to a disease of unmet need, right, where we feel we can build a drug around this. And then we work closely with that lab and with the university to kind of partner this with our industry partner to do the real hardcore drug development and do that work kind of in that industry level. And continue to do sort of the very specialized, biological work and assays here. So that's the program. I don't want to take up much more time, but just very quickly, just some of the IP considerations. We set this up in a way that we ensured that all IP that's generated through these Lab 150 projects remains with the institution from which it arose, right? So if we're working with a University of Toronto lab, 100% of the IP is owned by the University of Toronto as part of this project. We're working with these other groups, but we make sure everything gets assigned to U of T, right? And we think about that upfront. We ensure that that is the case. We really think about collaborations and making sure, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure as this goes on, about ensuring that ownership and control remain kind of where you want it to be, and really thinking about those issues up front. Then the goal eventually is to create startup companies, and license that IP into that startup company. So making sure it all stays with the University of Toronto or one of the hospitals at front, and then at a certain stage, making sure that in a smooth way it gets transitioned from the university into a startup company in a way that is, fair and equitable to kind of all groups, to ensure that we the company is set up for success, and the university is satisfied with a meaningful license, and the company is not kind of hampered and is able to go forward. And there's a lot that goes into that, but that's kind of really where we operate and how we try to make this successful. So that's it for me.
Great, thank you, Phil. So let's kick things off then with the conversation. I want to build on this theme of collaborations that has come up a bit. And Phil, you commented on the teaching hospitals. We saw the slide that John shared at the start. There's lots of great work happening at U of T, and there's this incredible network of research hospitals in our community. So starting from there, in health innovation, there's of course all sorts of collaborations that happen between institutions. So the first question will be back to you, Phil. What are some of the very first things? Again, this idea of timing comes up. And so at the very beginning, what should researchers be thinking about when collaborating between institutions? So for example, a U of T researcher who wants to collaborate with a researcher at Mount Sinai.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the very first thing to think about in that situation, these collaborations happen all the time, is I think, number one, do you see this being something that you will want to commercialize, translate? Is there anything that you think is something that's going to this collaboration that will lead to something that is a business approach in some way, right? If it's a pure academic collaboration, that's another thing. There's still some considerations, right? But you need to be thinking right up front, even maybe if that's not the original goal of this collaboration. Often it is that you think that there's going to be a collaboration aspect, a commercialization aspect to it. But so really think about upfront. Are you engaging in this for something that could turn into a company, a license, something that can be commercialized? And a lot of things can. So that's just kind of the first thing to think about. If that is a consideration, then right away kind of go to your tech transfer office. That's going to be my answer for most things. Talk to a commercialization manager. Just let them know you're having this conversation. If there is, some background stuff that you want to make sure is protected as you go into this collaboration, then that will turn into a disclosure. You'll have that on the record, and you'll talk about strategy before you go out there. Now, I know that's not always, going through that whole process just before you want to have a conversation with someone. That may not be practical in all cases. So we're all human beings, and and a lot of this is based on trust at the bottom line, right? So have that conversation with a collaborator that you trust, right? So there's no one size fits all. Have that conversation with the collaborator, but don't move forward with the actual research, right, until you've kind of had that conversation with your tech transfer office, get a disclosure in. And then the next part of this is really to think about what is the background IP that exists going into this collaboration, right? So you've kind of thought about this up front, and you've made sure that you're not kind of going to disclose anything that you shouldn't. You've talked to your tech transfer office, you're ready to go before you actually engage in the actual collaborative project, right, that you have funded. And it's a little while before you have this whole thing funded and you're ready to collaborate. While that's being set up, work with your tech transfer office, come up with what is the background IP that you have at your university, what is the background IP that's coming from the hospital, right? Get that documented. And you can work with your tech transfer office to put an agreement in place, which is called an inter-institution agreement, right? An IIA, to ensure, right, once you really launch this collaborative project, that up front what's going to happen if anything is commercialized, right? And you can talk to them about all the details of what goes into an IIA, thinking about splits and joint ownership, and there's a lot that goes into that, right? But really, I think the basics, the bottom line for this type of question and approach is just thinking about the stuff up front, having a discussion with your TTO, thinking about what each group has in the background, and being all set up so that as soon as you're ready to launch on a major project, all of that is recorded. You know what's going to happen at the other end. You've done the legwork. and then you can kind of, you know, engage in the activity that will generate new IP, and you know what's going to happen with that new IP.
Great. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about that scenario then that's beyond an academic collaboration between institutions. So say, for example, there's a startup company that then is spun out of one of those institutions. Maybe Morgan, you can speak to this in your experiences with Hippocamera, but what types of things do you think about when you're trying to decide sort of what IP to keep, you know, within the university or the institution, and if, when, and how to instead bring it into the company, and how you sort of manage some of those decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. This was something I had no idea about. And when I started this, I just assumed that it's best for the company to always hold the IP. Like that was my default. Like this is like, I need to get this into the company. And there are absolutely scenarios. So I'll just back up a bit. So much of fundraising or developing a company or looking for grants, they care about what stage you're at. And a lot of like what stage you're at is determined by where the IP lives. And so there are certain grants, for example, so NSERC I2I, where the IP still needs to reside. Certain phases of NSERC I2I grants still needs to reside with the university. If you've brought it into your company, you're no longer eligible for those grants. So, we almost took the IP out of the university and brought it into our company, but that would have closed off some doors for some grants that we wanted to apply for. Now, when you're out talking to investors, they want to know that your company owns the IP. So when you're at that stage, then it's important to, make sure that IP is assigned. And even backing up even further, when we first started thinking about this, it was really important that we had a term sheet in place that laid out very concretely, these are the milestones at which, when this happens, then you can transfer the IP into your company. But then once, we achieve those milestones, well, then we're on the hook for a lot of the patent costs, understandably, that we're paid by the university. So that's another thing, like, we need to make sure that we're able to come up with 70 grand. Of course, it's not, like immediately U of T is not, coming for my kids to get that money, but we have a period of time during which we can pay that. But, what I'm trying to say is that it's always nuanced, and there's a time, it's all about timing and knowing the stage that you're at and the opportunities that you're pursuing. And there's completely different answers based on what stage you're at.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so on this question of what stage you're at, then maybe Lawrence, you can chime in. It'd be interesting to hear about whether some of these considerations that Phil and Morgan have brought up in terms of where the IP lives and dealing with various institutions, what can you say about how some of these considerations change based on, what the company's current goals are, what markets you're looking at, particularly once you plan to go outside of Canada, sort of as one example. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I will kind of jump in and say to some extent these things are kind of set by the law. And so one thing to keep in mind is, who's an inventor in your application. And I mean, we might touch on inventorship somewhere else, but that's just a very specific legal standard. I just want to make that clear to everyone. And then ownership kind of falls from that. So you might have done a ton of work on a project, but you might not be an inventor. You might not be an owner then, that then gets transferred to U of T and the inventions policy. There's a lot of variables at play there. But a lot of those things are kind of predetermined, irrespective of how much effort you put into it. Now, that said, if you put a ton of effort in, you might be able to negotiate for a larger equity stake in the startup, whatever it might be. But don't let, and a lot of those ownership things early on, and might have to go to U of T because of the way things are set up, and that's probably the right place for something to land. But that in no way restrains you from sort of creative frameworks down the road in terms of how things kind of move and how a company might take it over, how that might be licensed out. The important thing is just to get it right. And that flows from getting the inventors right on the original patent application and making sure that the applicant is properly named on the patent application, all the documents are signed up, all that kind of basic stuff, where it helps to have, again, like a patent lawyer or someone kind of be really clear as to, hey, it's these three people, not that person, despite their important contribution. We'll capture them later in the company, but like, this is how that all flows. So That's really important, I think, is just, there are kind of really set rules to this, and they don't necessarily flow or follow how much someone's contributing to something early on. But that's the way it is. Double check it with, the IPO, whoever is kind of in charge, and then run with that. In terms of, again, so ownership doesn't bother me so much. I mean, we have lots of big agreements with companies here and there, and ownership is one thing, then you can exclusively license something. And so that's, there's a lot of different ways to get where you want to go in terms of making sure you have the right rights in place. Tamara, you also mentioned the importance of sort of looking overseas, and I do encourage that early on too. I'd say 90% of my work when I was in private practice was at the USPTO. We'd always file there first. The US is still a primary market for almost all these technologies. So despite you might be looking to NSERC or Canadian granting agencies, and that's a consideration that you want to file in Canada too. Be sure to also consider filing in the US, because for a lot of your investment money or everything else might eventually come from there. So that's just an important thing to keep in mind. So.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so sort of picking up on this idea of investment money, I think that one topic that's always top of mind in a startup company is fundraising, right? And so, Jeff, you commented a little bit earlier on about how investors are looking for certain things, and maybe that's not necessarily patent filings, but there needs to be a plan in place. So maybe you can expand a little bit on that in terms of what expectations investors have from an IP perspective.
Sure, and expectations of investors is will obviously vary from investor to investor based on their investment thesis and their degree of sophistication. But I think generalizing across different investors, their expectations are also proportional to the size of the check you're asking for, and that also correlates to the stage of the company. I think there's different degrees of kicking the tires that investors will do. There's basic level checks, hey, the IP exists, and you've got good ownership of that IP. There is then looking under the hood a little bit, looking at the core agreements that govern the flow of IP. A key problem that I see companies run into in diligence is a lack of certain agreements. They have they don't have agreement with one of the founders, or a graduate student was a key contributor to a piece of technology. There's no agreement that causes that IP to flow into the company. So lack of agreements is an issue that gets flagged quite frequently. But beyond kind of IP assets, I think investors also care about, what is your thinking around IP, and what are your behaviors around IP. So thinking is really about your strategy. Do you have a plan? Do you have a documented plan? What are your what's your thinking around growing your IP and using your IP? And behaviors is more around, are you taking steps to, for example, not disclose your inventions before filing IP? What are your BD people doing? As they go out into the world, what are your approaches to controlling kind of your IP? So those are things that really are coming from the company in kind of diligence. You speak to your thinking, you speak to how your company's behavior implements protections for your IP, and so that I think are if you're able to show you have IP assets or plan for getting them, and show that you have sophisticated thinking, and show that you have a company culture and set of behaviors that are protective of IP, that checks a lot of the boxes at kind of early stages. It does get more complicated as you start to go from Series A and to Series B. At some point, investors will want to understand that you've thought about not just your IP, but IP of third parties. As you bring your technology into the world, are you going to be infringing anyone else's IP? But at that point, you'll have more resources to do that type of investigation, and again, that comes later on.
Great. Yeah, I mean, you touched on sort of these missing agreements, and presumably when an investor is doing their due diligence, they'll be looking at all of those, and including existing sort of commercial agreements. So, we haven't touched on that yet, but I wanted to get to it. As an example, if there's research collaborations with an industry partner. So we're sort of, outside now the academic institutions. Can you comment on sort of any red flags that, researchers or companies should be watching out for when they're navigating those kinds of commercial agreements?
Yeah, absolutely. So, agreements govern relationships. A big common one are co-development agreements or collaboration agreements, and parties come together, pool their resources, and create some new IP. And they think about it as kind of a finite term collaboration or engagement. But what comes out of that engagement has our IP assets and certain obligations that can run forever. And so the biggest red flags then from an investment perspective are those ownership rights appropriate for the company? What are the obligations that extend past the term of the collaboration? And I'll give you some examples, right? So you create new IP, who's responsible for filing the patents, paying the costs of pushing that IP protection, who's responsible for enforcing the IP? If you have a bad actor that comes on, who enforces it? Do you have control? Do you foot the bill? And so there's this looking at the agreement, and looking at how that affects costs and risks going forward. And if the risks aren't allocated appropriately, that can be a red flag to an investor. I'll just give you one example of how that risk might manifest. Phil, I think, mentioned, companies bring in their background IP that can create kind of licenses to the other party, either for, the purpose of the collaboration or for going forward. There can be new IP created. There's a risk of infringement that often is allocated to, perhaps one of the parties. And if that risk isn't capped in a certain way based on dollar amount or based on time, that could create this hanging risk of, with lots of money attached that is really difficult, one, to insure against, and two, to kind of satisfy to an investor that you haven't just exposed them to potentially, millions of dollars of IP litigation. So, those are things that come up from time to time in these agreements, Tamara.
Yeah, so it sounds like these commercial partnerships can be fraught with various pitfalls that you need to watch out for. Morgan, I don't know if you have any experiences in building HippoCamera in working with various commercial partners.
I do. Yeah, actually, it was our first one before we were really ready, I feel, to have any commercial partnership. And we were approached by a large Japanese life insurance company to do a proof of concept trial. And that was initially, super exciting, to have like the business development come to us. We didn't have to, do any outreach and, yes, saying, and then we're working obviously with in Japan, and everything is in Japanese. So, there's a level of complexity there. Like everything needs to be translated. And it is so, and translation is really, really expensive, but it was really, really important that we had that done, because when we were first, when I got the first draft of the agreement for the trial, there was a clause just sneakily, embedded in the middle of a paragraph, which was that the company will own any IP that was localized in Japan as part of this pilot. So, at this point, we'd spent years developing this. They come, swoop in for a 2-month pilot and then own everything. And so, it was so early to us. We didn't need that trial at that point. And I was just like, forget it. It's a complete non-starter, and just played hardball, and that clause went away very quickly. But it was just such a reminder that, do not blink. Really, really look at everything closely.
Yeah, so it sounds like you knew and had the presence of mind to play hardball on that, and maybe potentially dodged a bullet on it. So maybe Phil can field this question. If someone in the audience is in a similar situation to the one Morgan is describing, sort of in unknown waters, what kind of advice would you have for them in trying to navigate that?
I mean, advice number one is to have a professional look over those contracts. If you're at the university, if this is still within the university setting, there are contract specialists at U of T who will look through contracts and look for some of these red flags that Jeff was referring to before, and the kind of thing that came up that Morgan saw. So really, it's make sure especially if this is a very beyond a very simple one-page letter or something that you fully understand. If this is a real legal agreement for something that's really important to your technology in your company, you need a professional to look it over. So that's number one. And number two is, exactly what Morgan saw and pulled out is just to really focus in on those parts of the agreement that deal with any sort of rights and obligations to the IP, right? So there's lots of ways. It's contract law. You can deal with IP in all kinds of different ways. The IP specialist on this call, can kind of go into that in finer detail than I can. But really, there is going to be sort of the basic level of who owns the IP, right? Whether it's one party or the other, whether it's joint. But there's also, for the kind of sponsored research agreements that we deal with, or thinking about licenses, there are all kinds of options, right? So companies will have all kinds of options to that IP, and really think hard about what those options are and what those really mean, right? They'll have some time limited amount of time, or it might be exclusive, and they have the exclusive rights to do certain things, right? You can really slash this in all different ways, but really think about what you are offering that company and how that might help or hinder you, especially things like exclusivity. You don't want to give someone that for too long, because that may not be the right partner for you, right? And you want to maintain your options to deal with all sorts of other potential partners, investors, other companies that you're working with.
Yeah. Tamara, I might just jump in and add that you will have conflicts in a large collaboration between other institutions or whatever. They will come up. So try to take those as opportunities to work things out. And communication is key. And some of the larger collaborations that I've been involved with, we have kind of scheduled, meetups. So it's not just the lawyers, because that's a bad idea, and it's not just the scientists who are on the ground, but there's sort of these, joint communication exercises, and that's where we can really hash out a lot of things and find out that, either both parties are overstating their position, or you get to a common ground quite quickly. So build in those opportunities for communication into your collaborations. And I think that's really important to keep things moving smoothly, and you'll avoid a ton of legal fees. It's just everybody wins.
Great advice. Thank you. Yeah. So I want to just switch gears a little bit here and talk about some of the special considerations that come up when dealing with health technology in particular, right? And, this covers a really broad range of different kinds of technologies. So maybe back to you, Phil. Can you talk a little bit about, if there are different strategies that should be applied to these different types of technologies, and sort of how to think about or approach these sort of subsets, I guess, of health innovation?
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of each of these kind of approaches to different types of health technologies could be a whole webinar on its own. So I think the goal here is just to kind of bring up a little bit the really high level details to get people thinking about some specialized things about their field. And then I would encourage people to dive a lot deeper. But at a very high level, we kind of think of things as kind of three main buckets, right? There's kind of computer-based technologies, so AI and software-based technologies. There's kind of classic devices in the health space, medical devices. And then there's, something that's very specific to health innovation, which is your classic life sciences innovations, like molecular therapeutics, and diagnostics, right? So kind of think of these in 3 different buckets, and they really are very different, and you have to take very different approaches to them. So when you're thinking about sort of AI and software type technologies, the key here is to really think about the whole range of different types of IP protection, right? Because it's not as clear exactly whether this is going to, whether the software or the algorithms you're working on are going to be patentable. So there are still patents in that space. There are AI. I know I've talked to people who have really strong AI patents. It's going to be hard now because there's a lot of AI out there. But so you're still going to consider patents, but you're going to consider copyright. You're going to consider trade secrets, know-how. It's kind of the whole, bucket. It's the strength of your coders and your data. It's really a holistic approach when you're dealing with that space, right? When you're looking at medical devices, this is sort of more your classic patent space, where it really is, for the other 2 buckets, it really is patent focused, and I'd say kind of the devices is more classic kind of patents where you figure out what your device is early. And it's really about searching is important, and really understanding, getting a really good patent search and figuring out what it is about your device that's different than everything else out there. So spend a lot of time searching, really figuring out what's unique about your device and what else is out there, and then get going, and you can kind of get that patent in place and protect your device pretty early on. With therapeutics and molecular-based inventions, the trick here is that you often will not have your invention right away. You'll come up with your initial idea of your molecular target you want to hit, and then you start building a drug, and that process takes years. And there was a period where people were filing patents on gene sequences and on molecular targets and proteins, and those days are over. You can kind of still protect those types of things, but in a much more convoluted, complicated way, not just a target, a gene sequence. Talk to your patent professionals to get into that. But generally, here it's really about thinking about timing and how you can kind of keep things secret and protect and make sure that patent will eventually be filed at the right time. It's all about timing, and sometimes you do need to file a little early to get something in the door to have those business discussions. But really, the strategy is important here. You really want to think about timing, not to file too early. Sometimes you need to. You can always abandon and file later. There's a lot of strategy here, but it really is about timing when you're thinking about that type of technology.
So within this framework of these buckets, so we sort of have, therapeutics, devices, and software. Morgan, can you maybe speak to whether there were sort of these buckets or kind of types of technology that you were developing at Hippocamera, and how you sort of identified what was most important to capture the value of the IP from, and sort of how you went about identifying what those key aspects were?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we sat down with experts, and there were so many conversations, about what is patentable and what is not. And I just couldn't believe it. They were these ridiculous scenarios. Like if 10,000 people walking behind you with a pad and paper could come up with the same solution, even though that will never happen, that idea in and of itself is not patentable. And I'm like, what but it is what it is, and you have to operate within the system. So it was really sitting down with experts and deciding which aspects of our invention were novel and non-obvious and met all of these criteria, and then protecting as much as we could. And the reason why we took that strategy was because we needed to publish. I need to get grants. I couldn't keep it a secret, and I didn't want to either. I want to get feedback from my colleagues on the interstices of the application. And I think there's a certain element, not all of it, but there's a certain element that one could possibly reverse engineer. And so for those things, once you put it out there, if one is able to reverse engineer it, then you need to have that protection in place, I would assume. So that was our thinking. And I really just, many conversations where we sat down and I was asked about the same aspect of our technology in 8 different ways, for the patent lawyer who was writing the writing our patent to be able to then transfer that into this legalese to make it as bulletproof as possible. So yeah, that was our process.
Yeah, that's a great point too about the reverse engineering and how, if it's easier to reverse engineer, it makes the technology perhaps less, desirable to keep confidential, sort of as a trade secret. And maybe Lawrence, you can talk a little bit more about that. I know you had some comments on trade secrets, and we've defined these different buckets, but obviously they're not necessarily clearly defined or differentiated. There's overlap. And maybe if you can sort of speak to, from the Deep Genomics perspective, in particular, sort of as the priorities of a company, changes, or the goals evolve, how you sort of navigate that in terms of your IP strategy.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, as we started out, we were more of a high-tech company with these foundational AI machine learning, aspects to us. But now recently following a lot more on molecular therapeutics, which is sort of more of a classical domain. And one thing going back to private practice as well, I'd seen a lot of great research tools that would come out of academic institutions. And those can be a bit tricky to protect. You can get claims to methods of, let's say, screening for a drug or trying to design something, but enforcement of those is also a bit tricky. So a lot of new technologies might start with one of these platforms of, hey, we can do all this great stuff with this. We don't actually have a product to sell, but it's a way of getting there. And that's just the first step. So I think a lot of companies actually need, not just this method of, let's say, screening for an anti-neoplastic agent or whatever it might be, but you're going to want to get that agent itself as well. So you can file on those methods, those research tools. But they're not as valuable as you might hope or think. Now, there can be a useful kind of stepping stone to move things along. But I think that is a transition I've seen a few times, more in private practice than at my current job, where there's a great idea for, hey, we could possibly use this and we could use it to get somewhere. Well, you got to take it there too. So it's a long and difficult process to do that. The patent system is also frustrating, and there's no doubt of that. I mean, remarkably, we have one patent system for AI, widgets, cell phones, and drugs. There's lots of regulatory things that are different when you want to sell, let's say, software versus selling a therapeutic, and that's important to keep those in mind in the healthcare space. I can't stress that enough, that be cautious as you go along, talk to some regulatory people, know what you're going to get into. Even for software as a medical device is sort of a burgeoning field, and it's important to keep that in mind of what data you might need to collect. And if you can do experiments that help both your patent portfolio and your regulatory submissions, all the better. But you do need to be aware of that and navigate it carefully. So a lot of things to think about, and patent strategy is just one of them, especially in the medical field. But it's also fun, right? And I want to stress that as well. And I think Morgan can speak to this, and from firsthand experience, is that it's really neat to take some of these ideas and see how get the business community involved. That's a completely different language as well. Talking to the VC people and talking to the patent agents. But at the core of it, there's always a cool idea, like a neat technology that you want to see get out there. This is how you do it. So a lot of hard work, but fun.
Absolutely. Great. So, we want to leave some time for audience questions. So I think what we'll do now is we'll stop the recording and turn it over to audience Q&A.